When I was younger, probably still in middle school, we lived in the McDonough homes. I shared a room with both my younger sisters. The house was fine. We didn't experience much paranormal activity. But I remember this one night that I was struggling to fall asleep because it was a school night. I was tossing and turning and both of my sisters were fast asleep already. Everyone in my family was asleep as well, and in my family my parents never let us stay up late on a school week. Everyone was supposed to go to bed by 8 or 9 p.m. We were used to that because we've been doing that ever since the day we started going to school. The house was dead quiet. Our bed was placed by the corner with me sleeping on the edge facing the door. I always keep my door closed at night because I'm a chicken myself. Anyways, as I was lying there trying to go to sleep, I then suddenly heard my doorknob slowly turning. It was probably around 10 p.m. by now and really late for me. This sound startled me and I got scared and pulled my blanket close to my face. The doorknob continued to turn a little bit, almost like a little kid trying to get inside, but they weren't strong enough to open it entirely. I was so scared to even move. This continued for a couple more minutes and then it just stopped. I guess I got so scared that I fell asleep right after that. The next day I woke up and didn't think too much about it because stuff like that never happens and there wasn't much for me to worry about. After a while and some time had passed, it happened again. This time, my whole family was still up and it was around 7 or 8 p.m. I had a major headache that night, so I decided to go rest in my bed while my parents were in their room and my younger brothers were still taking their baths. My sisters were in my parents' room as well. I was the only one in my room with the lights off. As I was laying in my bed facing the door, the doorknob started to turn again. This freaked me out and the lights were still on in the hallway, and I could hear my parents in their room just talking, and I could also hear my brothers in the bathroom. This was when I decided to look at the door from my bed to see if I could see a shadow reflecting from the light in the hallway through the little space under the door. As I was slowly observing the door, I realized that there was nothing, no shadow underneath the gap. If there was somebody standing behind my door, you would be able to see their shadow, but there wasn't anything blocking the light that was reflecting under the door. I made sure to look at the doorknob and could clearly see it turning. This continued on for a couple more minutes and then it stopped. The second it stopped, I jumped out of bed and ran to my parents' room as fast as I could. When I got there, everyone was busy doing their own things. My brothers were still in the bathroom and I asked my parents and everyone if there was someone that came to try and open my door. They all said no and that they haven't even left the room. I told my parents what happened and they just shrugged it off like it was nothing to worry about. But I guess at the time I was still young and dumb and I let it pass again. This event didn't happen again until after that. I still wonder if it was only my imaginations or not, but I remember clearly hearing the noise of the doorknob turning, and it still freaks me out to this day when I think about it. I also heard that the McDonough homes were built on top of Indian burial ground, so I'm not sure if that's the reason why. Back in my younger years in high school, I had 2 jobs to help my parents with bills. I had just come back from my second job that morning and didn't want to be bothered by my younger siblings getting ready for school, so I decided to crash downstairs in the spare bedroom in the basement until after lunch and head out to school. I think it was probably around 10 a.m. and I could hear my mom upstairs in the kitchen making lunch. I could smell the food for her and my dad. I heard her walking up and down the stairs since it was right above the room. She then came in and told me to get up and get ready for school. I told her not yet until 11:30. So she told me not to sleep too long since I'm a girl and it didn't look right. Anyways, she left and closed the door behind her and I turned on my side and I closed my eyes for a few seconds when she yelled out my name at the top of the stairs saying, "Why are you sleeping so long? So long enough to grow old?" I yelled back at her, I'll wake up at 11:30, just leave me alone for another hour." I looked at the clock and a few minutes had passed by since she was downstairs talking to me. I was still laying on my side and closed my eyes. Then I heard the door opening, thinking that it was my mom coming to bother me again. I turned around, but to my surprise, there was no one there, and the door was wide open. So I got up and closed the door. I went back to my old position in bed, and as I was lying there again, my mom was screaming at the top of the stairs again at me. I didn't answer her this time, and laid down ignoring her. Again, I heard the door open again, and this time it swung open real fast and hard to where it made a loud bang when it hit the wall. I felt her squeezing my calf going upwards towards my thighs. I ignored her and pretended like I was in a deep sleep. Then I felt her hand gliding up to my waist and squeezing my chest. Right there and then, I wasn't able to move, scream, or breathe. I was struggling to regain my senses, and it felt more than 10 minutes. Then, whatever it was, finally left me and walked away. I got up and took off out of that room and up the stairs in search of my parents, but they were nowhere to be seen. First, I looked into the kitchen, and there was no food. Usually, my mom will save me some food in a bowl with a plate covering it, but it looked as if no one was in the kitchen making food at all. Then I looked outside into the driveway, and my mom's car was still out there. So I went out to look for her in her garden in the backyard, and it's about 150 feet away from our house. Sure enough, both of my parents were out there. I asked my mom how long she's been out there, and she said that the both of them had been out there since they came back from sending my siblings to school, which was at around 8 a.m. To this day, when I visit her, I never go downstairs alone. I remember when my family and I went to my grandma's funeral in North Carolina. We drove there on a Friday night and got there Saturday morning, and later that evening at around 11 p.m., everyone wanted to get some rest. So me, my older brother, and his wife told my dad that we will be back at 5 a.m. in the morning and went to sleep at my aunt's house. Their house is a trailer on a 15-acre wooded area, so everything outside was pitch dark. We all slept in one room, and it had 2 twin beds, and we set the alarm to ring at 5 a.m. Plus, there was no one home except for us because everyone was still at the funeral. The alarm rang and I woke up. I turned on the lights and checked the clock. Then I told the 2 of them that it's time to wake up. They told me to go back to sleep, and I was okay with it because I was still tired too. I turned off the light, and that's when I saw a shadow coming near me. I swear I froze up and could not move. As it almost grabbed my hand, I quickly turned on the lights and it disappeared. I was so scared that I ran straight to the bed, making so many noises that it woke up my brother and his wife. I told my parents about it, but they brushed it off and told me that it was nothing. Driving through the night, my brother asked me why I didn't turn off the light, but I told him that I saw a freaking shadow or something that came at me. I explained to him how the shadow looked like Grandma but was much shorter. Then, after I told him this, the car suddenly died in the middle of the road, out of nowhere. My brother tried to start the car, but it would just not start. Then I had to pray to Grandma, who had just passed away, to help us get the car started, and miraculously, it did. The car somehow started by itself again. This was quite the popular story in my family. A few years back, before my uncle passed away, he would encounter weird occurrences with animals. One time, he went to the farm and a squirrel came and climbed on him, and he tried to get it off, but it wouldn't go. After a few minutes, the squirrel let off and ran away. Then there was an incident with a black cat running inside their house until they chased it out. They would experience these strange phenomenons, and they asked a shaman to see what it was. It turned out that the spirit of our dead grandfather was coming to get him. My uncle is partially deaf and wears a hearing aid. The story goes that back in his earlier years as a child, when he was young, he would always play in the creek and dig up holes and had fun hunting around. Then one day when he went playing in the creek, he dug out a hole and something was inside of that hole. He was playing with the things home, and when my uncle came back home, he got sick. He then started to go deaf, and my grandma asked a shaman to do a ritual, and they found out that because he had ruined the entity's home or something like that, it had displeased the spirits in the area. So then after the ritual, everything went back to normal, and my uncle was forbidden to do any of his old habits. But then one day, he went back and decided to dig holes again, and that's when he became permanently deaf. All through his life, he felt very lonely, like no one cared about him. He was the youngest, and because he was deaf, he felt lonely on the inside. He would tell the aunties and his brothers that they didn't love him, and his mother also. The saddest thing was that my father's generation didn't know how to show love. They would always leave him out in cases that they thought they would be too difficult for him to handle, but he's in fact very good with a lot of heavy-duty labor stuff. My uncle was married and had 2 kids, but he still felt alone. Throughout all the years, my uncle was left alone and was never asked to go hunting or fishing with my dad and uncles. I knew deep down inside how lonely his world was, even though he had a family, a house, 2 cars, and a boat. Last but not least, he had us. Throughout my teenage years, my uncle and I were Bonnie and Clyde. We went fishing together and hunting together because no one had invited him, so we always hung out together. I remember one time I wanted to go to July 4 and he took me up there with his family, and there's nothing I can't say or do to thank him ever enough. He is the greatest uncle and his wife is the greatest auntie as well because they would always take me out so many times. I would babysit their kids while I was talking on the phone with some girls, but his kids always loved me so much and they cut their hair to be just like mine. His family cherished me so much and I loved them, but there was nothing I could do or save them to help my uncle's lonely heart. The night before he passed away, he told all of us that no one loved him and he cried. I always knew how he felt and the pressure to be useful in the community. My grandma never really loved her youngest son because she herself was lost in the game of choosing favorites. She was supposedly living with my uncle, but she had their stuff there and always lived with my second uncle. The most tragic thing happened when my uncle and his family passed away in a house fire. We all cried our tears out. The saddest thing was that their whole family had passed away at such an early time. Before this, there were signs of disasters waiting to happen, and their house was quite creepy. Some say that they could hear footsteps in the attic, but I'm not sure if it's true though. After a year or so, after my uncle and his family passed away, my grandma started to cry a lot and said things like how much she cared and loved them very much, but it was too late. My grandma started to talk to herself and eventually went insane. She would call the spirits of my uncle and his family to come and eat the food that she set out outside of his house. One day, some relatives and their kids had come to visit my grandma. They had a little girl who could see the spirits of dead people, and she told my grandma to stop because she saw my dead uncle's family that came to eat the food. This scared my grandma, and she was afraid to be by herself. Keep in mind, my grandma is a strong lady. When people fled the country to come to America, she would walk through the deserted towns to get water, and she wasn't scared. But now she was afraid. Due to these occurrences, she now lives with us and our family. But I think that you never really know what you have until you lose it. So cherish the moments that you have with your family today because you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. This was a story that happened a while ago. I was babysitting my nephew and he fell asleep earlier than usual. Typically, my brother and his wife would go to my sister's house late at night. Since my nephew was sleeping, they left him in my bed. It was after 1 a.m. and I had just cracked the window open. Then I slid into bed and my nephew was soundly asleep. I tossed and turned, trying to get comfy, and then my nephew woke up, frantically crying. I flashed my phone at him so he'll know that I'm there with him. But he pushed past my phone and curled up into my arms, still crying, covered his head with his blanket. I thought that he was just being needy, so I didn't bother much to soothe him. Rather, I sort of messed around with him, mocking his cries. That just agitated him and he cried even harder this time. This time, it sounded more serious, almost sad and scared. He even moved deeper into my arms and closer to me. Finally, I took him seriously and asked him what was wrong, but he didn't answer me and just kept on crying. As I attempted to comfort him with my phone and touch, he carried on with his crying, moving closer and closer to me, nearly pushing me off the edge. Then there it came. The window slammed shut, leaving the curtains open. It was pitch black outside, and that scared the both of us. My nephew's crying ceased instantly, and we both froze. I stared sternly out at that gaping curtain, with deep nervous breaths as my nephew seemed to be frozen and breathing heavily under the blanket. He was still curled into my arms. I stared and stared. preparing to catch a glimpse of what might have been scaring my poor nephew. I laid there for what seemed like the longest minute of my life. This was when I realized that our dog had gotten out of his crate. He was sleeping in the room with us, and when I finally got out of bed to check on his crate, it turned out that he had knocked down the tub of lotion that I had used to crack the window open. This caused the window to fall back down and blew the wind that pushed the curtains open. As my nephew calmed down, he said he was crying because he was looking for his parents and not used to being away from them so late at night. I honestly thought that I was going to see a ghost. Anyone from Stockton should know or be familiar with this story. It happened a few years ago, or it could be longer, but a girl had hung herself and left behind her baby, who was probably a year old, if not younger at the time. After her death, her mom took care of the baby, and there were times that the baby was sleeping in the room while the mom was out in the living room and the baby would cry by itself. But by the time that she got into the room, the baby had stopped crying completely. So, one time when the baby cried, the mom decided to look inside of the room. She slowly opened the door and peeked inside and saw that her dead daughter was sitting next to the baby. She figured that that was probably the reason why the baby stopped crying every time she gets to the door. Nobody knew why she had committed suicide, but not too long after she had hung herself, her cousin had also ended his life too. The story that I heard of why he ended his own life might be different from the ones that were told to others, but from what I understand, they said that he didn't like his lifestyle, and that was the reason why he had hung himself. During his funeral, people said that the girl who had initially ended her life had a younger sister who tried to overdose herself. Luckily, the family had took her to the hospital in time, and the doctors were able to save her. The family asked her why she had wanted to overdose herself, and she said that she didn't want to take her own life, but her older sister made her do it. About a week before the cousin had ended his own life, people came to the house and some were out in the garage playing card games when they thought they heard his voice yelling hysterically, saying that he didn't want to die, but that she made him do it. Everyone looked around and, dumbfoundedly, they tried to figure out who it was or what and where that voice came from. This was when, all of a sudden, one person ran into the house and everybody started running for the door. I'm not sure if anyone else in the immediate family had died after him, but soon after the death of these two people, both of the families had moved out of that area. Another Hmong family moved into one of the houses and their daughter had also hung herself in the closet. The family had just came from Thailand and knew nothing of the house or the previous owners. It wasn't until their daughter had passed away that they finally were told about the two deaths that had happened before they had moved into the house. Back in Laos, my uncle went to this funeral. He was the drum player, so while everyone else was on the floor praying with their incense, he was the only one standing up and he had a clear view of the dead. Since the dead body had been around for a few days, there was obviously an abundance of flies. Well, he saw one of the flies land on the dead guy's head. Then, the fly walked over to the dead guy's eyelid, and he saw the dead person flinch. Of course, he was scared as heck because he was the only one who witnessed this, and running away while in the middle of drumming is a big sign of disrespect. So he just told himself that it wasn't real and continued drumming. For some reason, he just had to look at the body again because his mind was messing with him to confirm if it was real or not. So he looked over at the body again while he was drumming. Yet again, another fly landed on the dead guy's face, and when the fly walked over to the guy's eye, his whole eyebrow twitched. It scared the crap out of my uncle, so he just dropped the drumsticks and ran past everyone that was praying. To his surprise, a few other scared youngsters ran out with him. Some OGs came out to ask what happened, and he just kept on yelling, "The dead guy blinked! The dead guy blinked!" So they had to send him home and find another drummer. They did Jingle Bell for him, and that's when the story ends, just like any other Hmong story. My mom became a shaman last year. Right after that, she would dream of my cousin who had been deceased for about 5 years now. She would cry to my mom and say that she's being punished by the Suka. She warned my uncle and them that their daughter wasn't happy, but they didn't listen. Around that same time, my uncle's kids would experience strange phenomenons around their house. Once, my Uncle C was in bed talking on the phone when all of a sudden she saw a dark figure run by her bed and then underneath. She got really scared and ran outside. Her younger brother, Shaman, keeps on hearing heavy breathing near him whenever he slept. The oldest brother, who has a wife and 2 kids, keeps on having bad dreams. His oldest child, a 2-year-old daughter, would get up in the middle of the night and run outside of the bedroom, giggling and playing with someone. Finally, my uncle got worried and decided to do Waneng for the whole family. They decided to invite my mom Sifu to perform the ritual. My mom Sifu asked her to go watch and learn. The thing about my mom is that her shaman guides not only allows her to do the shaman stuff, but also allows her to talk to the dead, and sometimes the dead could even talk through her. Well, while her Sifu was performing, all of a sudden, my mom just closed her eyes and started to groan. My sisters and I were there, so we became afraid and didn't understand what was happening. I asked my mom what was wrong and she just shook her head and said that she wanted some rest. Thus, we took her to sleep in C's room. I was worried about my mom, and so my sister and I sat on the ground at the foot of the bed where my mom was laying down and played cards. The 2 of us were laughing and talking when all of a sudden, my mom woke up and her eyes were closed shut, tears streaming down her face. I could immediately feel that the atmosphere had changed. The room was very cold now. Then my mom spoke and said, "Go tell my mom to come here." At that moment, I knew that my mom was no longer here, and whoever was here was most likely my deceased cousin. I ran out quickly into the room and gathered her family into the room with my mom. My mom, or deceased cousin, cried and cried hysterically and told my auntie how much she had loved her, and how she would always go with her to work and make sure that she comes home safely. She also said that she didn't mean to scare her siblings, but only wanted them to know that she loved and missed them. Then she turned to her dad and yelled at him, saying that it's his fault that she died and that he better love her mom and siblings. She kept on crying and everyone was becoming afraid, so my mom Sifu stopped her ceremony to try to get my deceased cousin out of my mom. The Sifu finally sent her spirit away. After that, my mom slumped down and passed out for about 2 good hours or so. Ever since then, my mom tries really hard not to let anyone take control of her body anymore. They say that it's not good to let the dead do that to the living. About 3 weeks ago, my grandfather passed away. At the funeral home, my mom's face became pale and she was groaning the way she did at my cousin's house. She walked out of the funeral home, and later on she told us that Grandpa wanted to speak to us, but she didn't want to let him do that because everybody would be afraid. I found this story from another site which gives me the chills to this day. This is a true story, and I saw it with my own eyes. Heck, I even touched it. My grandfather's brother passed away about 7 years ago, and we've been visiting his grave every year ever since. In 2004, his wife remarried to another man, and there was a huge family dispute. Her children wouldn't let her remarry because they didn't want to betray their father. However, the other family said that it was her decision and not that of her children. So, after a while, the children gave up and the wife remarried. It was also around the time of the anniversary of her husband's death, so my dad and I paid a visit to his grave. My dad opened up a can of soda and placed it on the grave, and I placed down a few oranges. We then burned some incense and knelt down and bowed and stuff. But then, all of a sudden, we noticed that the can of soda was boiling. No, it wasn't fizzling, because I felt it with my hands and it was hot to the touch. The soda was boiling, and it spilled over some of the graves and got on the oranges. My dad cried right there and then. He then said this, and I remember it to this day. He told his uncle that to not be mad and that we are his children, and that he should not be mad because we are of his blood as well, and we still love him even to this day, visiting him every single year. Right after my father had said those words, the soda stopped boiling, and my dad and I were standing there looking at the tombstone. After about 2 minutes or so, the creepiest thing happened. There was no wind, no breeze, absolutely nothing. The can tipped over by itself and the 3 oranges rolled off of the gravestone. Now, the gravestone was perfectly horizontal and wasn't tilted anywhere, so there was no way the oranges could have rolled off by themselves. The soda that tipped over spilled more soda over the gravestone as my dad and I just stood there and watched. Then, it hit me. The drink spilled everywhere on the grave, except on the picture that was embedded into the gravestone. I looked at the picture and I could feel his eyes staring at me. We went home and told his children about it. They all cried and it was pretty emotional and everything. Then about 3 months later, his wife died in her sleep. At the funeral, my dad asked if I had remembered how many oranges I had put on the grave. I said that I had put about 5 oranges down, and my dad asked me if I remembered how many oranges rolled off of his grave. I said 3. My dad said that the husband came and got the wife because 3 months after our encounter, she died. We had to hooplee for my dad and I afterwards. I don't think I'll ever forget that day in my entire life. This one time I took my brother to go see his girlfriend, and it was the first time we were going to see her. She gave us the directions, and as he was on the phone with her, we were making every turn the way she told us. We came across a T intersection, and she kept telling him to go straight. I was like, dude, are you sure we are at the right place? Because we can only turn left or right. He kept saying that she said to go straight. I told him to look up and see where we were at. He looked up from his conversation with her, and we were at the entrance of the cemetery on Lexington and St. Paul. If I had turned left or right, I'd run right along the cemetery. If I went straight, we'd go right into the cemetery. Right when he looked up, the line went dead. He called and called again, but couldn't get a hold of her anymore. After that, he said that they broke up, but he could never get a call through with that number, as it was always a busy signal. To this day, it is still very creepy. Here is a short story from Laos. Maybe the details are a little off, but the storyline is still here. Back in Laos, there was one beautiful girl who was supposedly possessed. She got married to her husband and she was very, very happy. However, at night, when she would sleep, she turned into a scary ghost or demonic-like figure, and he was scared to sleep next to her. Then, on the second night, he asked his father to come into the room and look at her too while she slept. Oh, that's a little weird. His father said that he saw the exact same thing that he saw. A scary demonic woman sleeping on the bed in her clothes. They didn't say anything to her at all, but the next day they took her home to her parents, and when they got there, her parents told them that they didn't want her anymore. So, with nothing left to do, they decided to leave her there. Because of this, she ended up taking her own life. I hear OGs say that when all of a sudden you see a lot of cats or more than usual around the home, that means that there's going to be something bad happening to the people living there. I find this to be true from my own personal experiences. One of my Yang cousins owns his home for quite some time now, and in their neighborhood, there's hardly any cats around. Once in a long while you'll see a stray cat here and there, but one year, he started to see more and more cats roaming around his property. He didn't think much of it until after his dad had passed away. During the funeral, they were talking about how his dad passed away, and the topic of cats came up. Some older OGs was telling him that this was a sign when all the cats were showing up at his house. The weirdest thing was that after his dad passed away, the cats were no longer coming around. In my personal experience, my dad was pretty much like my cousin's dad. We've owned our house for over 15 years and we've only had stray cats here and there as well. During the time that it was close to my dad's death, our house constantly had cats during the evening and into the night. We don't know where these cats came from, but during the day, they're all gone. This happened for well over 1 year before my father passed away too. My mom was on a vacation to Thailand. She asked for me to go and watch her house while she was away, so my younger sister and I took turns sleeping at her house. It was my night off and my sister came to sleep at my mom's house. I lived right across the town from my mom's house. My sister didn't feel right that night and came home over at my house at 10 p.m. She wanted to sleep over. The next day, I had this weird feeling about my mom's place. My daughter and I went over to see if there was anything going on, and we did. We did not expect for this to happen. When we got there, there was blood everywhere. And I mean everywhere. On the walls, on the ceilings. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was scared and called the cops. They didn't really help. They just told my sister and I to clean up all the blood with gloves on. Then the next day, my dad and I went over. There was this weird amount of hair all over my mom's bed. I have no clue what happened that day or night, but I haven't slept over there ever since. Here is one of my stories that I will never forget and changed me over the past few years. This happened to me when I was 18 and on my way to my first year of college. Anyways, one of my brother-in-law's cousins had passed away in his sleep and he never had any illnesses or whatsoever. He was a very wealthy young man and worked for a big company. He was never married and believed to be a real nice guy. I never knew who he was or had ever met him. Going to his funeral was the first time I have ever heard of him, and his family had made brochures about him to pass out to guests who came to the funeral. I'm not a big fan of funerals ever since my dad had passed away, but that's a different story to tell later. When my family and I got there, it was kind of weird how they did his funeral. They said that since he was a single man during his lifetime, they were going to do the funeral a little bit differently, which they did. When they were supposed to be sending his spirit on the way back, instead they were chanting the song for him to find a wife. They told him to find whoever he liked and for him to marry, since he didn't marry anyone when he was still alive. I thought it was kind of weird and creepy how they were singing like that to him in Hmong. Good thing we only stayed there for about 30 minutes to an hour and then left back home. I did everything normally that I would usually do on a Sunday, then headed off to bed. During the whole night, I was feeling a little bit odd. I don't know how to explain it, but I just had a feeling that there was something missing, and I didn't know what it was. Since I didn't know what was wrong, I just shrugged it off and read my book and then went to sleep. That night, I had the weirdest dream. I dreamt that I was on my way home from school and I was on the city bus. The bus approached my stop and left me off like usual. As I crossed the street and headed towards the hill to get to the back door, I see all these huge tigers and lions surrounding my whole house. I stood there frozen and tried to think of how I could get past these sleeping tigers and lions. I kept looking and saw a clear view as to where I could run straight in between them and reach my back door. I took up my keys and got them ready to open the door, and then I took off. Just as I reached my door, this much bigger tiger jumps out of nowhere and bit into my right hand and scratched my feet. He tried to grab at my injured hand, but my family saw me and they opened the door for me just in time. The tiger looked so mad and angry. It couldn't have come into our house, so he roamed around back and forth. It was like he was only there waiting for me. Just when I thought it was going away, I saw it running real fast to try to get through in the window and grab me, and that's when I woke up. As I woke up, I was sweating like crazy, and it was during the fall, which I remember was very cold that year. I felt gross and was relieved that it was only a dream, so I got up and went to shower. Then I changed and went downstairs to help my family cook. I got done chopping up all the veggies and remembered my dream, so I told everybody about it. Just as I was done telling my mom about the dream, she looked like she was a little worried and was going to say something to me, but she turned around and yelled out that the oil was burning. Since I was the closest to it, I lifted it off the stove, the handle wasn't sturdy enough and the hot, boiling oil spilled all over my right hand and a little bit on my left foot. These were the two places that I was bitten and scratched in my dream. It was so painful. It felt like someone was poking me with hot needles 1,000,000 times over and over. Everybody stopped what they were doing and rushed to my side to see what happened. Let's just say the top layer of my skin was cooked. My hand curled up almost into a fist and I couldn't move it because it would have hurt way too much. My mom went and got me some medicine that was really good for burns. The burns on my feet healed within 2 days and went back to my original skin. As for my hand, it was healing, but then it began to bleed again and again. I couldn't sleep for a while because I would constantly have bad dreams over and over. It was like one right after another. Then I started to get really sick after 2 weeks and my hand wasn't getting any better. So we finally went to the doctor and got it looked at. He gave us some cream for it and it healed within 2 days, but it never looked the same again. So I'm now scarred for life on my hand there. Although my hand and feet healed, I still wasn't getting any better. I would still get headaches in the morning, but when the nighttime comes, I'd feel a little bit better. I couldn't go back to school and had to take off 2 months and just stayed home. Finally, my mom got so worried that she got my aunt, who is a shaman, to come and look at me and do a ritual to tie another red string for me. That day, they had to tie 2 strings, one on my hand and my foot that got burnt. I was so sick that I was dozing off during the whole thing. All I remember was my aunt and mom saying that he was not human and that he needs to go away and find someone like him and not a living person who isn't willing to go with them. They said that I must have fought real hard to even still be here this long. By now I pieced it all together, and the reason why I was getting so sick and had my skin burnt was because of my brother-in-law's cousin who had passed away. After all I went through and what my aunt did for me, he finally left me alone, and I started to gain my weight back and my strength. But every now and then I would get really bad dreams about someone that I love. I always pay attention to those because as soon as I get up from those dreams, I would get a phone call about that person. And almost every single time, something would come visit me that isn't human. I would know because I would get this edgy feeling, so I'd either change my position or go sleep somewhere else. Because of these events, I try not to go to funerals anymore. This happened to me and my brother the other night. We were having a boring day at the gym playing volleyball, so my younger brother and his 2 friends came up to me and asked me if I can take them to go to the gas station to buy some snacks and rent a DVD and just kick it at our house. I agreed and we went to get our DVD and junk food. We arrived home and my brother and his friends quickly bolted upstairs to sit and kick it back. While I was in the kitchen to go and cook, after about 2 or 3 hours, I hear a knock on my bedroom door. "Hey, Max, can you send my friends home now?" my brother pleaded. I nodded and told him that I'll be right out in 5 minutes. Before I knew it, we were all in my car and my brother took shotgun, while his friends were in the back passenger seat. They only lived about 15 minutes away, past a high school besides our cousin's town. I made a right turn onto this road, which I normally take as a shortcut towards my cousin's house. Tonight, for some reason, that road seemed very eerie. The road seemed to have narrowed and the trees in the forest grew taller and seemingly darker than I normally would have known. But then I noticed a truck in front of us and I shrugged it off. My brother and his friends were blabbering away about how cool and funny the stupid movie was, when all of a sudden, as my eyes scanned the road, I saw a pitch black figure quickly dart across our path and into the woods. My eyes widened and I was confused as what it was. I asked my brothers and his friends if they also saw what I saw, but they ignored me as they were still chatting away in their own little world. I freaked out, but I just kept myself calm so that they wouldn't make a fuss. Still driving and keeping my cool together, I prayed a little bit that I only imagined that event and that we were getting closer to my cousin's house. Right after, I calmed down a little bit and the rascals quit blabbering. My brother and I saw the truck in front of us screech its tires, skid violently, and swerved past the yellow line and into the bushes of the woods. It literally flipped upside down, but only tipped on its right side. We heard a loud crash with its shattered glass windows. By now, we were all in a panic, screaming and yelling. One of the friends told us to call the cops and said that we had to go and help them. I didn't say anything, and I was still in shock for a moment before realizing that I had pulled over on our side of the curb just ahead. My brother and I were still in the car, but his friends were out before us and already looking inside, calling out if the driver and the passengers were okay. I told my brother to stay in the car, and right after that, I got out and was about to run up to the friends and see what was going on. My brother's friends were running back towards the car, shouting, "Go, go, go, get back in the car right now." At that moment that I saw them running back, I was scared and opened the car door and slammed it. Within a few seconds, the friends were in the car and they drove us off to one of their houses. When we got there, one of the friends insisted that we sleep over for the night. I happily went inside, dragging my brother without any doubts. Before we got to bed, I called my parents and told them that my brother and I were going to have a sleepover for the night. After a moment of silence, the friends finally broke out and said that when they went to go check on the car, they didn't see anybody or hear anyone inside of the truck.